Chapter 10, Part 2. In Part 1, I explained that simple pre-test and post-test is not quite valid because any changes or any difference between pre-test and post-test cannot necessarily be attributed to the treatment. Therefore, in situations like this, it's better to use time series, which means you have a series of observations before your treatment, a series of observation after your treatment. And that is going to minimize most of the threats I just mentioned. And that's why this type of research is considered a quasi-experimental research rather than non-experimental, because it takes care of multiple threats to internal validity. However, you should know that even with the time series, history might play a role as a threat to internal validity. Although it's very unlikely, but it's possible that the external event happens exactly simultaneously with your treatment. Let me explain this by using this picture. As you see in the first picture, the external event or the outside event happens before your treatment, and the average score goes up before your treatment. So obviously here the treatment is not effective. Something else happened to increase the average. In the second example, the treatment happens before the outside events, but the average score doesn't go up right after your treatment, and it goes up after the outside event. So again, we know that the treatment was not effective. However, in the third picture, the outside event and the treatment happens at the same time. Although it's very unlikely, but it's possible. And in this case, any changes in average score after the treatment could be attributed to either the treatment or the outside event. One of the advantages of using time series is that you can do quasi-experimental research, or a research that's very close to a true experimental research, but using only one individual or one case. And that's why time series is used a lot when researchers are working on a single subject or a single case in their research. And finally, there is another type of research which is called developmental research design. Developmental research design are a type of quasi-experimental research. They're not true experimental, and you cannot say these are non-experimental research. They are somewhere in between. But we have two types of developmental research, or perhaps three types. One is cross-sectional and the other one is longitudinal. A cross-sectional research is when you compare different age groups. For example, you compare a group of third graders with a group of eighth graders in terms of their attitude toward the opposite gender. The advantage of using cross-sectional research is that you don't have to wait like from third grade to eighth grade to see how their opinion changes. You just compare two age groups to see if there is a significant difference. The other advantage is that it saves you a cost of the follow-up and observation. The weakness of this research is that you cannot follow individual cases and you cannot observe specific changes that happens to a particular individual. And another problem with cross-sectional research is the cohort effect. The cohort effect means that sometimes the differences that you observe between different age groups is not because of the developmental changes, but it's because different groups belong to different eras or different cultures. For example, if you compare a group of 40-year-old and a group of 60-year-old and a group of 80 years old in terms of their opinion about drugs legalization, you may see that the older group has a more negative attitude. However, this negativity, it's not a developmental change. It just happens because this 80-year old people belong to a different generation and a different culture and a different environment. The other type of developmental research is the longitudinal research. This research involves observing a group of participants for a long period of time. For example, you start at age 4 and you end up your research at age 15, and you observe all individuals as they go through these ages. The strength of this type of research is the absence of the cohort effect. The second advantage is that you can see how a single individual's behavior changes with age. However, there are multiple weaknesses with longitudinal research. First, there is a time issue. You have to spend a lot of time as a researcher to observe these participants, and also it requires time for participants to continue their participation. Second is the cost. Observation, measurement, travel, these all cost money. The third factor is the attrition or dropout. Because it's a long period of time, it's very likely that some participants move or they decide not to continue. And finally, there is the testing effect. If you observe and measure or test your participants over and over, they become test-wise, and your measurement is not going to be valid anymore. And finally, there is a method that is a combination of developmental and cross-sectional. So instead of observing the same individuals for a long period of time or comparing different age groups, you compare the results obtained from separate samples but in the same situation and in the same location. For example, you go to an institution like a university in 1970 and you study female participation in leadership positions. And then 20 years later, in 1990, you go to the same institution and you do the same kind of survey, the same kind of research, and then again 20 years later in 2010 you do the same thing, and then you compare the results to see how female participation in leadership positions has changed over this time interval.